In previous videos, we have gone over the claim that fascism, in particular Italian fascism, was a phenomenon that was created by the capitalist elite to prevent a communist revolution from occurring within Italy. Similarly, these claims also have been applied to Nazi Germany, and today we're going to look at the relationship between the Third Reich and big business, and also the beginnings of the National Socialist German Workers' Party in Germany and who funded that, and in particular Hitler's relationship between the party and the large scale industrialists at the time. Primarily, we're going to be getting our information from the book by Henry Ashby Turner titled German Big Business and the Rise of Hitler. In this video, we're going to seek to dispel some of the myths regarding the financial funding of the National Socialists by big business. And we're going to see that a lot of the claims that big business was behind the National Socialists is either extremely exaggerated or outright a lie.
While most big businessmen pondered National Socialism with puzzlement and skepticism in the wake of its spectacular election success of September 1930, contacts began to develop between the NSDAP and the capitalist camp. These came about informally, usually arising from social relationships as individuals came into contact with each other through mutual acquaintances. Only a few outright conversations of important businessmen to the cause of National Socialism resulted prior to the Third Reich. As early as the winter of 1930 to 1931, however, the Nazis began to benefit from the influence and, in some cases, the financial resources of well-connected fellow travelers and other benefactors from big business circles. For a variety of motives, these members of the capitalist camp chose to view Nazism in an optimistic light. The earliest recorded big business initiative toward establishing such contact with the Nazis after election triumph came from Emil Georg von Strauss, a director of the Deutsche Bank und Diskontogesellschaft, one of the largest of German banks. Regarded by some as a ruthless parvenu whose allegedly dubious Württemberg patent of nobility occasioned ridicule in some Prussian circles, Strauss had established himself in Berlin during the late Empire by exploiting the social opportunities opened to him by his marriage to the daughter of Admiral Georg von Müller, for many years chief of the last Kaiser's naval cabinet. During the Republic, Strauss joined Strassmann's DVP and contributed generously to it financially. In 1930, he entered the Reichstag as one of the DVP's diminished delegation. He quickly began to ingratiate himself with a much larger Nazi delegation. As the opening of the new session approached, he reportedly arranged a meeting with President Hindenburg for Hitler and Göring at their request, but so as to leave the impression that the initiative had come from the president. The day before the new Reichstag convened, Strauss lunched with members of the new Nazi delegation and helped to arrange for Nazi support of the unsuccessful attempt by the new leader of the DVP, Ernst Schulz, to unseat the longtime Social Democratic president of the Reichstag. The Nazi delegation's proposal a few days later of bills calling for nationalization of all large banks and confiscation of the property of, quote, bank and stock market princes, unquote, apparently disconcerted Strauss at least temporarily and made him the butt of ridicule in the liberal press. But that and other manifestations of Nazi economic radicalism did not deter him from his efforts to maintain contact with the National Socialists. At the end of October, he assured an acquaintance that, despite obvious difficulties, it would be possible to work with the NSDAP in the Reichstag. The Nazi with whom Strauss found he had most in common was Hermann Göring, deputy chairman of the greatly enlarged National Socialist Reichstag delegation. The son of a governor of the German colony of Southwest Africa, Göring became an ace pilot in the war and served as the last commandant of the famed Richthofen fighter squadron. For his feats in air battles, he received Germany's highest decoration for valor, the Polar Merit Medal. Educated for an officer's career, he had developed aristocratic pretensions that were reinforced by his marriage after the war to a woman from a Swedish noble family. Since he moved easily in fashionable and affluent circles, Göring could, unlike most prominent Nazis, deal with a man like Strauss on a footing of social equality. His cynicism about the socialism of Nazism presumably added to their compatibility. Goring was thus in an excellent position to serve as an intermediary between the bank and Hitler. During the spring or summer of 1931, he arranged for the two to talk at length in the course of a cruise along the rivers outside Berlin on Strauss's motorboat. Another of the guests on that occasion, Otto Wagner, later recalled that Hitler's presentation of his political views during the voyage so impressed Strauss that he offered to break with the party he represented in the Reichstag and join the NSDAP at once. But according to that same account, Goring dissuaded Strauss from taking such a step by arguing that the banker would be more valuable to the Nazis if he remained in the DVP and used his influence there in the interests of the NSDAP. While this story remains uncorroborated, Strauss did continue as a DVP deputy and financial contributor right down to the Nazi takeover in 1933, even though Wagner later recounted him among the advisors to his economic policy section of the NSDAP. Strauss's friendly relations with the Nazis soon became so widely known that Jewish customers of the bank he served as a director reportedly protested or even withdrew as clients. His reputation also suffered as a consequence of his part in the banking crisis of the summer of 1931. In 1932, at the relatively young age of 55, he resigned his directorship and withdrew to the less active and conspicuous role of a member of the bank's supervisory board. Although Strauss never became a Nazi Party member, he later received a seat in the hand-picked Reichstag of the Third Reich, becoming a guest of the Nazi delegation and vice president of the chamber. Not long after he himself had established contact with the Nazis, Strauss put them in touch with a man who would eventually become one of their most helpful fellow travelers, Hjalmar Schacht. A Freemason and one of the founders of the staunchly Republican German Democratic Party, Schacht must have seemed an unlikely candidate for that role. This was especially so in view of repeated Nazi denunciations of him because of his role as president of the Reichsbank from 1923 until his resignation in March 1930. Nazi agitators had also pilloried him on numerous occasions as a key figure in the international Masonic conspiracy purportedly bent on taking over Germany. In 1929, Gottfried Feder dealt with Schacht so abusively in a speech that he instituted slander proceedings, dropping the action only when Feder took refuge behind his parliamentary immunity. But following Schacht's resignation from the Reichsbank in protest against certain modalities of the implementation of the Young Plan, he moved rapidly to the right. From his self-imposed exile at his country estate, Schacht made repeated forays into the political arena, delivering speeches in which he denounced the efforts of the Brüning cabinet to fulfill the terms of the Young Plan, which he himself had helped to negotiate. Following the Nazi election gains in September 1930, Schacht began to view the NSDAP in a more positive light. In December, he publicly expressed admiration for the vitality of the NSDAP and proclaimed the impossibility of governing very long in opposition to the will of the nearly 6.5 million Germans who had cast their ballots for the Nazis. When his old banking acquaintance Strauss invited him to dine with Hermann Göring in mid-December, he readily accepted. Schacht seems to have got along well with Göring, who arranged for him to have dinner on January 5th, 1931, at his home so that he could meet an even more prominent Nazi, Adolf Hitler. That meeting, too, proved successful. Schacht, as he later repeatedly confirmed, came away with a favorable impression of Hitler's energy, convinced he had found a man with whom one could cooperate. Hitler, for his part, seems to have marked Schacht as a prestigious expert who might prove valuable when he needed such men to run the government. Neither side publicized this meeting of minds, and Nazi propagandists continued to attack Schacht well into 1931. Yet by mid-year, rumors began to circulate to the effect that he had joined the NSDAP. As Schacht never became a party member, he could truthfully deny those reports. His favorable attitude toward Hitler became known in business circles, however, long before he began actively to promote the Nazi leader's cause in 1932. This certainly represented an asset for Hitler, for although Schacht had at the time no active role as a businessman, most of the leaders of German big business held him in high regard. Still another significant figure from the capitalist camp, Fritz Thyssen, dined at Göring's along with Schacht and Hitler on January 5th, 1931. By the time his octogenarian father died in 1926, most of the Thyssen family's holdings had been absorbed by the United Steelworks. As chairman of that enterprise's supervisory board, Thyssen held a largely honorific post that left him free to play a prominent part in the international steel cartel and to dabble in politics. His political course took him rightward within the DNVP, where most of the big businessmen in the DNVP became dissatisfied with Hugenberg's hardline and obstinate negativism. Thyssen remained loyal to the party chairman. In 1929, he actively supported Hugenberg's sponsorship of the referendum against the Young Plan, from which most of big business held aloof. At a public meeting of the National Committee for the Referendum, Thyssen again encountered Hitler, whom he had met briefly in Munich in the fall of 1923. No sustained contact resulted, but the Nazis' gains in the election of September 1930 aroused in Thyssen hopes for a rightist resurgence. An enthusiast for corporatist ideas, he found especially appealing the commitment in the NSDAP's program to the creation of corporatist chambers as part of the restructuring of the state. When Brüning attended a meeting of the Industrial Reichsverband in November 1930, Thyssen expressed the hope that the Chancellor would manage to bring the Nazis behind his government. He similarly urged Hugenberg and other DNVP leaders to seek ties with the NSDAP. Thyssen's own relations with the Nazis became closer soon thereafter when an acquaintance, Wilhelm Tengelmann, a junior Kohl executive who had joined the NSDAP at the urging of Kerdorf in October 1930, introduced him to Göring. Thyssen at once developed a liking for the former flying ace, whom he found both impressive and reasonable. Göring, in turn, saw to it that Thyssen soon sat listening to Hitler across his dinner table. Thyssen, like Schacht, seems to have responded favorably to this personal cultivation. Although he remained a member of the DNVP for another year and officially joined the NSDAP only after the, quote, seizure of power in 1933, Thyssen made no secret of his sympathy for Hitler and his movement, even before he openly committed himself to the Nazi cause in 1932. Others from the capitalist camp who became Nazi fellow travelers after the NSDAP's stunning electoral gains of 1930 enjoyed none of the prominence of Strauss, Schacht, and Thyssen, but proved in some cases even more valuable to the Nazi cause. The journalist August Heinrichsbauer provides a case in point. Because of his connections in Ruhr industrial circles, it was an event of some significance when he met Gregor Strasser through a mutual acquaintance in the fall of 1930. Heinrichsbauer, a militant foe of socialism and a hardliner on labor management relations, found he had much in common with Strasser, despite the latter's links to the Nazi left wing and his occasionally strident anti-capitalist rhetoric. Friendly relations developed between the two, and Heinrichsbauer began to report favorably on Strasser to his industrialist patrons. Emphasizing Strasser's endorsement of private property and entrepreneurial initiative while downplaying his hostility toward big business, Heinrichsbauer contrasted Strasser with Goebbels and depicted him as a man of moderate views on economic issues. Through Heinrichsbauer, Strasser met still another journalist, Walther Funk, who became an active Nazi after a brief period as a fellow traveler. As economic editor of a conservative Berlin financial newspaper, the Berliner Börsen-Zeitung, Funk had attracted considerable attention in rightist circles by virtue of his hostility toward the SPD and the trade unions, his attacks on parliamentary democracy, and his militant opposition to the Young Plan. When Strasser found Funk well disposed to National Socialism, he introduced the journalist to Hitler. The Nazi leader quickly assuaged Funk's major misgiving about the NSDAP by informing him that the programmatic writings of Feder and other Nazi economic theorists need not be regarded as binding on the party in the future. According to Funk's post-war testimony, after his contacts with the Nazis became known, businessmen of his acquaintance, particularly among the coal and steel industrialists of the Ruhr, approached him and urged him to join the NSDAP. They were worried about the party's attitude toward economic affairs, he explained, and wished to see someone in the party's leadership whose judgment on such matters they trusted. Whatever the circumstances, Funk resigned his editorial job at the end of 1930 and went to work for the new economic policy section of the NSDAP. In June 1931, he officially became a member of the party. Once or twice a year, Funk stated in Nuremberg, he met with the industrialists who had urged him to join the NSDAP and shared with them his impressions of the economic orientation of the party. Still another Nazi fellow traveler came from the ranks of journalism, Theodor Reisman Grohn, editor of the conservative Essen daily Rheinisch-Westfälische Zeitung. One of the founders in the 1890s of the right-wing nationalistic Pan-German League and a long supporter of anti-republican tendencies, Reisman Grohn had given favorable coverage in his paper to the Nazis' 1930 election campaigns. Later, in 1933, he would become the first Nazi mayor of Essen. When the Nazis decided they needed a newspaper in Essen, they sought his advice through Otto Wagener, the former manager of a small manufacturing firm who had become chief of staff of the SA in the fall of 1929 and was preparing a year later to set up the party's economic policy section. Although Wagener harbored what he took for socialist aspirations, his upper-middle-class background as a former army officer and businessman made it easy for him to establish rapport with men like Reisman Grohn. According to Wagener's later account, Reisman Grohn extended his help despite recognizing the potential competition for his own enterprise that a Nazi paper would represent. Through his intermediacy, a printing shop was found and arrangements made to publish what became the National Zeitung of Essen. Moreover, Reisman Grohn's son-in-law, Otto Dietrich, later Hitler's press spokesman, gave up his job as the Munich correspondent of a major Leipzig paper to become one of the editors of the new paper. When Wagener encountered financial problems in launching the National Zeitung, he turned to Hans von Loewenstein, executive director of the Bergbavaren, the Association of Ruhr Coal Operators. Wagener does not explain in his memoirs how he gained entree to Loewenstein, but it seems likely that Reisman Grohn again played a role. Reisman Grohn had served earlier as general secretary of the Bergbavaren and still enjoyed good relations with that organization, which had rescued his paper from financial difficulties in 1929 by purchasing a sizable block of his stock. According to Wagener, Loewenstein gave no aid but referred him in turn to Ludwig Grauert, managing director of the Employers Association of the Iron and Steel Industry in the Ruhr, generally known as Ibert Nordwest, located in Düsseldorf. As both Wagener and Grauert recalled independently after the war, Grauert arranged for a loan from the association to the National Zeitung, which Wagener recalled as 50,000 marks, Grauert as 100,000. Grauert testified that he obtained approval for the loan from the association's chairman, Ernst Ponsgen of United Steel, by arguing that it represented an opportunity to dampen the anti-capitalist agitation of the NSDAP by putting one of the party's newspapers into debt to an important business organization. With the help of the loan, which Grauert later remembered the Nazis never repaid, the National Zeitung commenced publication in mid-December 1930, soon gaining a reputation as a comparatively genteel Nazi organ. In accounts of Hitler's rise to power, one repeatedly encounters a story of his successfully touring Germany in order to win over the key business leaders of the country during the second half of 1931. All such accounts have a common source, a volume of memoirs by the press chief of the NSDAP, Otto Dietrich, which the party publishing house issued in a mass printing beginning in 1934. According to Dietrich's memoirs, in the summer of 1931, the Führer suddenly decided to cultivate systematically the authoritative leaders of Die Wirtschaft, who stood at the center of resistance as well as the parties they supported, so as to break them, stone for stone, out of the structure of the regime. During the following months, the Führer crisscrossed the whole of Germany in his Mercedes compressor. He turned up everywhere for confidential conferences with leading figures. They were arranged everywhere, whether in the capital of the Reich or in the provinces, in the Kaiserhof Hotel or in an isolated woodland glade in God's free nature. Confidentiality had to be preserved in order not to provide the press with material for agitation. The desired effect did not go unattained. Through sheer repetition, but possibly because of its literary panache, Dietrich's account has become generally accepted as a reliable source of information. Yet, as a master practitioner of the Nazi big lie propaganda technique, the Otto Dietrich of 1934 scarcely seems a likely candidate for trustworthiness. His book proves, under examination, a sycophantic codification of the myths the NSDAP generated about Hitler's feats on his way to the Reich Chancellery. Dietrich's portrayal of Hitler's pursuing and breaking down the resistance of Germany's business leaders so closely conformed to the official party line, according to which the Führer obtained power by winning the confidence of Germans from all walks of life, as to merit the greatest skepticism. Moreover, in his less quotable post-war memoirs, written without the aid of the Nazi propaganda apparatus, a much subdued Dietrich made no mention of any such successful pursuit of business leaders on Hitler's part. Instead, he recalled, quote, "The authoritative men of Die Wirtschaft and the associational officials of industry displayed a cool political reserve and awaited developments. Hitler, the drummer, had to rely in his propagandistic endeavors on the financial sacrifices of his party comrades, on membership dues and entrance fees for rallies." End quote. Curiously, these words of Dietrich have gone unmentioned in the numerous studies that accept his propagandistic tract of 1934 as the truth. If the numerous meetings Dietrich alluded to in 1934 had in fact taken place, it is difficult to explain why these left no traces in the rich and extensive private papers of the leading industrial figures of the Ruhr. Those men were by 1931 quite curious about Hitler, yet their correspondence, which reveals contacts of some of their number with the Nazi leader during 1930 and 1932, records none for 1931. Letters found in the files of 3 major Ruhr industrial figures do reveal, to be sure, that in September 1931, Hitler had let it be known a week in advance through intermediaries such as Funk and Heinrichsbauer that he stood ready to discuss the political situation with 12 or 15 spokesmen of heavy industry at a Bierabend scheduled in his honor at the Berlin apartment of Prince Victor Zervide, a retired diplomat whom Göring had befriended through his Swedish wife's family. All 3 of those whose replies are preserved, Paul Rusch, Gustav Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach, and Hans von Löwenstein, executive director of the Ruhr Coal Industries Principal Association, the Burgbavaren, declined. Their curiosity about Hitler obviously did not suffice to merit disrupting their schedules and traveling to Berlin in order to sip beer in the presence of Germany's most notorious teetotaler. Other industrialists may conceivably have attended the gathering at Prince Wied's, but if they didn't, the absence of any reference to the occasion and subsequent correspondence suggests they learned nothing they considered of sufficient importance to share with those who had declined to go. In any event, such a casual invitation through intermediaries hardly constituted hot pursuit of Germany's industrial elite on the part of Adolf Hitler. The background of another oft-repeated tale about purported secret doings of big businessmen with Hitler that took shape in 1931 provides some sobering insights into the origins of the sort of journalistic accounts that form the basis for so many of the allegations of aid from that quarter to the NSDAP. It began with an article published in mid-January in a left-liberal pacifist newspaper, the General Anzeiger of Dortmund, a major Ruhr coal center. Hitler had visited Essen at least 3 times in recent months to negotiate with Hans von Löwenstein of the Burgbavaren. These negotiations had taken place for the most part at opulent dinners to which Hitler sat down with the princes of coal. He had moved about Essen in a car loaned to him by his hosts and spent his nights there at one of their residences. In the course of their consultations, Hitler had assured the coal executives of his willingness to be flexible about the length of the workday, despite the NSDAP's public pledge to uphold Republican laws establishing 8 hours as the standard. In return, the coal executives had made 2 sizable financial contributions, each in 6 figures, to the Nazi Party. They had also underwritten a bank loan of 90,000 marks to the Nazi newspaper in Essen, the National Zeitung. Repeated in numerous leftist newspapers, the story quickly began to develop elaborations and embellishments. By the spring of 1931, reports of additional $500,000 contributions to the NSDAP by the Burgbavaren, often supplying considerable detail about the purported secret sessions at which those grants were approved, became commonplace in the social democratic press, despite flat denials by the officials of that coal operators organization. In October, Rudolf Breitshed, a widely respected social democratic leader, confidently proclaimed from the rostrum of the Reichstag that the coal industry had imposed a levy of 50 pfennigs on each ton of coal the miners brought out of the ground in order to raise funds for the coffers of Hugenberg's DNVP and Hitler's NSDAP. Spokesmen of the industry countered by pointing out that a levy of such magnitude would yield around 50 million marks a year, a sum those 2 parties might find very difficult to use up. The same spokesman also cited an official government inquiry to the effect effect that the total overhead cost per ton of coal amounted to only 42 pfennigs. Subsequent repetitions of the story reduced the size of the alleged political levy on coal to the more plausible figure of 50 pfennigs a ton, apparently by the simple expedient of striking off a zero. By November, the Social Democratic press began to portray the Nazis as the sole beneficiaries of coal funds, with the levy attributed not to the Burgbavaren, but to the bituminous coal cartel, the Rhinisch-Westfälische Kohlen Syndicate. At some point, the story acquired still another twist when responsibility for the cartel's decision to support the NSDAP was assigned to 84-year-old ex-Nazi Emil Kurdorf, who by 1931 had been retired from an active role in the coal industry for 5 years. Republican Prussia's political police, who served as Social Democratic interior minister, took a lively interest as early as January 1931 in the reported secret meetings in Essen between Hitler and the coal executives of the Ruhr. The day before the General Anzeiger story appeared, the two journalists responsible for it contacted a police agent in Essen and gave him essentially the same account, but with additional details. The journalists specified that the two contributions to the NSDAP had amounted to 700,000 and 400,000 marks. They claimed that Hitler had spent the night at Löwenstein's house as early as August 15th, 1930, after addressing a Nazi rally in Essen. Their information, they explained, came from an Essen industrialist privy to the doings they reported on, but on whose identity they could not yet disclose. A week after the General Anzeiger printed its story, the police found it potentially significant that the Nazi National Zeitung had denied only the charge that the coal operators had underwritten a loan for it. The paper had passed over in silence, the police noted. The allegations about meetings between Hitler and the operators, as well as about contributions from the latter to the NSDAP. The official investigation continued for 6 months until July 1931, when the police abandoned in frustration their efforts to verify the General Anzeiger story. The journalist's source, the provincial governor, explained in his final report to the Prussian interior minister, had refused to make an official statement, and the police had been unable to find any corroborating evidence. The governor added that the Essen police insisted that the source did in fact have close relations with the industrialist in question and was holding to his story. The governor might also have noted, but did not, how curious it seemed that not one of the other 650,000 inhabitants of Essen had noticed any repeated comings and goings by Germany's most controversial and least inconspicuous politician. It would be misleading to create the impression that the Nazis made no business converts during 1931. From all indications, increasing numbers of businessmen all across Germany became party members or sympathizers that year. Those who did so, however, came not from the ranks of big business. They came instead from the middle reaches of industry, commerce, and finance. They headed, in some cases, quite sizable enterprises, employing hundreds of workers and involving capital that sometimes ran as high as millions of marks. But most such firms fell far short of the big business threshold of 20 million marks of nominal capital applied here. These smaller firms outnumbered many times over the ones which comprise big business, as defined earlier in this volume, and their owners and executives were far more numerous than those of the largest firms. At the end of 1929, nearly half of the aggregate capital of the most widespread form of incorporation, the Aktiengesellschaften, rested with firms capitalized at levels below 20 million marks. Yet despite their numbers and the amount of capital they commanded, executives of such firms found themselves, to their frequent resentment, with little or no voice in the national associations of Die Wirtschaft, in particular the Industrial Reichsverband, whose councils were dominated by spokesmen of large-scale enterprises. The middle reaches of German business had provided the NSDAP with some of its leadership cadre even before the Depression struck. From the ranks of the small manufacturers came Martin Muschmann, the Nazi Gauleiter of Saxony from 1925 until the demise of the Third Reich 20 years later. Incongruously for a Nazi tough who distinguished himself as much through the use of his fists as through any other qualities, Muschmann presided in private life over 3 lace factories in the small city of Plauen, in the backward Vogtland district of Saxony. In northern Baden, Wilhelm Kepler, later one of Hitler's economic advisors and holder of a number of high positions in the Third Reich, played a prominent role in developing a potent local party organization after joining in 1927. Kepler worked in the town of Eberbach for a chemical company, owned by an uncle, that produced photographic gelatin under an agreement with the American firm of Eastman Kodak. In March 1928, Kepler reportedly sent out 800 invitations to a talk by Hitler in the Heidelberg Municipal Hall. A police report described the 670 who attended as almost exclusively industrialists. In view of the small-scale manufacturing that predominated in northern Baden, it seems likely that those present came, like Kepler himself, from the ranks of Germany's lesser businessmen. In Munich, the party won an active supporter and advocate within business circles in Albert Peach, the proprietor of a small but prosperous suburban chemical plant that produced hydrogen peroxide hair bleach. In the Third Reich, Peach headed the Nazis' Reich Economic Council. In August 1929, Otto Wagener abandoned a business career to become chief of staff of the Nazi SA and later head of the party's economic policy section. Formerly director of a Karlsruhe firm that manufactured sewing machines and bicycles, he gave up a partnership in a wholesale company that dealt in plywood and veneers to cast his fortunes with the NSDAP. Wagener shared with Mushman, Kepler, and Peach a fierce hostility not only toward the Marxist parties, but also toward trade unions. All four boasted that they had kept the plants they directed free of organizers and strikes. That sort of anti-union militancy survived much more strongly in the middle reaches of German industry than in big business circles where employers had been forced to come to terms with organized labor or see their enterprises paralyzed. This animus toward trade unionism pervaded the pages of the weekly publication that catered to the informational needs of the middle range of entrepreneurs, Die Deutsche Arbeitgeberzeitung. It adopted a much harder line in that respect than the organ of the Association of Large Industrial Employers, der Arbeitgeber, and became the first entrepreneurial publication to accord favorable attention in its columns to the NSDAP. The political importance of the middle range of business bulked particularly large in the state politics of the Republic's federal system, as the Nazis' experience in gaining their first foothold in government demonstrated. The NSDAP crossed that significant frontier in January 1930 when Wilhelm Frick became Thuringian Minister for the Interior and Education in a coalition cabinet installed with the votes of four bourgeois parties and the NSDAP. The negotiations preceding the formation of the Thuringian cabinet proved arduous, as the 6 DVP deputies in the newly elected Landtag, whose votes were needed to make a majority, came under great pressure not to support the installation of the NSDAP in the government. Spokesmen of the DVP elsewhere in the country warned in the name of German liberalism against allying in a coalition with an anti-parliamentary party such as the NSDAP, and local business interests in the DVP balked at that step because of socialistic pronouncements in the Nazi press. Eager to obtain for his party its first ministerial appointment, with the attendant gain in national respectability, Hitler himself intervened. Accompanied by Rudolf Hess, Otto Wagener, and Frick, he traveled to the state capital, Weimar, and met with a selected group of about 20 prominent persons drawn from the bourgeois parties, the state bureaucracy, and the Thuringian business community, invited to tea by Gauleiter Fritz Zackel in a private dining room at the well-known Hotel Zum Elefanten. That evening, Hitler addressed a much larger audience of the elite of Thuringia's Bürgertum at another Weimar hotel, an occasion also arranged by the local Nazis. According to a pro-DNVP newspaper in Weimar, he carried off something of a tour de force by not once mentioning the words National Socialist in his 2-hour speech. Nor did Hitler deal with economic questions, aside from asserting that Germany needed to reduce its reliance on foreign trade and increase its arable soil in order to become less dependent on other countries. Most of his talk seems to have been devoted to denunciations of parliamentary democracy and Germany's Marxist subverters, who were, he warned his listeners, leading the country towards civil war. The audience responded, according to the Weimar newspaper account, with enthusiastic applause. 2 weeks later, after protracted negotiations, the proposed coalition cabinet, including Frick, gained office when the DVP deputies cast their votes with those of the other bourgeois parties and the NSDAP. A few days after Frick's installment as minister in Thuringia, Hitler boasted in a letter to a loyal follower that he had turned the tide in Thuringia by bringing the business community there to exert pressure on the DVP in support of the NSDAP's admission to the state government. In view of the DVP deputies' abandonment of their initial resistance to that arrangement, this seems a not implausible boast. Some documentation from Thuringian industrial circles lends additional credence to Hitler's claim. In a report to member firms in March 1930, the manager of a Thuringian business association, who had joined the NSDAP in January, described having intervened in the political process to bring about a suitable cabinet formation and thus help resolve the parliamentary crisis. The organization in question was the Labor Relations League of the Thuringian cement industry. The league's principal members, the dozen firms producing cement and related construction materials, bulked fairly large in the industrial landscape of Thuringia, a region politically fragmented until 1920, sparsely endowed with mineral resources, unblessed by economically strategic rivers, and bypassed by the development of modern big business. A territory of small towns, Thuringia lacked a city with as many as 100,000 inhabitants. Its industries, specializing mainly in glass products, porcelain, toys, and precision instruments, still reflected their origins in the first half of the 19th century or even earlier. Its factories had remained small by 20th century standards and, with the exception of the optical instrument industry in Jena, were often outmoded. Virtually all lagged far behind their larger, more innovative competitors in other parts of the country. The executives of the member firms of the Thuringian Cement League felt strong hostility toward the great capitalists of Germany. Having observed the bourgeois parties backed by big business repeatedly join the Social Democrats in adopting costly welfare state measures in the Reichstag, they took seriously charges to the effect that the capitalist magnates in Berlin had secretly allied with the SPD in a plot to make the country's small entrepreneurs shoulder an ever heavier tax burden. Such businessmen probably found very attractive the Thuringian Nazis' pledges to reduce government spending sharply by lowering the salaries of ministers and other state officials, thereby clearing the way for tax cuts if the NSDAP were admitted to the cabinet. From all indications, the cement producers also proved receptive to assurances from their organization's manager. The NSDAP official program need not be taken seriously. Despite public statements by some of its spokesmen, he told them, the party neither favored socialization nor opposed a sort of price fixing the cement producers had long practiced by means of a cartel. A request for legislative help sent to the party's Thuringian headquarters in early 1932 by the owner of a fever thermometer factory employing 600 workers in the town of Roda suggests that the attitudes of the cement producers do not represent an aberration in the context of that state's business community. That manufacturer had joined the NSDAP in the spring of 1931. Apparently, in large part because of wrathful indignation about the ruinous effects on his business of a Marxist law enacted during the Republic that has subjected fever thermometers to accuracy tests. He ended his plea for help by reminding the leaders of the National Socialist German Workers' Party in Thuringia that in his region the Nazis were to be found among the small manufacturers, not among the workers. By the autumn of 1931, relations between the Nazis and the manufacturers of Thuringia had already developed to a point that the statewide industrial association extended a formal invitation to the 6 Nazi deputies in the Landtag to attend a meeting of its members in Weimar. Not all Germany's small and middle-range manufacturers shared the cramped attitudes of those who ran outmoded factories in remote Thuringian towns, but virtually all suffered acutely under the impact of the Depression. The economic crisis threatened them much more profoundly than it did the men of big business. Large enterprises resembled the proverbial well-to-do profligate debtor for whom, when illness struck, creditors would hire the best medical experts they could find, not being able to afford his demise. Numerous buffers, backed by sizable reserves of capital, protected large firms from the businessman's ultimate nightmare, insolvency and the plea of bankruptcy. The national government itself represented the buffer of last recourse. The Brüning cabinet demonstrated the unwillingness of the Reich authorities to allow big enterprises to suffer the consequences of insolvency when several of the large nationwide banks had to halt payments in the summer of 1931 and when the Borsig Locomotive Works, one of Berlin's largest industrial employers, could not meet its creditors' demands during the autumn. In those and other cases, the government, unwilling to face the predictable economic, social, and ultimately political consequences of permitting the collapse of large enterprises that had failed by the going rules of capitalism, attempted to refloat them with public funds. In other instances, the government fended off bankruptcies by guaranteeing commercial credits, or even extending loans itself to imperiled large firms. Such enterprises, though not necessarily their executives, had clearly come to enjoy a kind of economic immortality simply by virtue of their size. Their failure would set off chain reactions of bankruptcies on the part of others who had lent them funds or depended on them for business. Cessation of their operations would thrust on the state unemployment fund not only their own employees, but also those of the firms that supplied them with raw materials or distributed their products. The costs of such far-reaching consequences in terms of further reduction of business activity, exacerbation of the already chronic decline in tax revenues, and additional unemployment with all its attendant expenses and risks simply seemed unacceptable to any government of rational men. For smaller enterprises, however, such deterrence against ultimate calamity rarely applied. Their jeopardy seldom sufficed to unite their creditors behind an agreement to suspend demands for repayment of debts until they weathered the crisis. Nor did a danger of insolvency on their part attract the attention and awaken the protective impulses of government. They were too numerous, too inconspicuous, and the consequences of their failures were too limited to make them eligible for the kind of buffers that shielded big business. For these smaller enterprises, failure and extinction remained frighteningly real possibilities as the Great Depression relentlessly throttled business activity to an extent no one had imagined possible. The really desperate businessmen of Germany held forth in the middle and lower ranges of industry, commerce, and finance, not in the charmed circle of big business. A Rhenish manufacturer recalled in his memoirs what it felt like to experience the depression from such a vulnerable position. A young man at the time, he struggled to help save two family factories founded in the city of Krefeld in the 19th century to produce specialized industrial machinery. At the outset of the Depression, the factories had employed some 650 workers and operated profitably. But the crisis struck them hard. Each week consisted of a struggle with ever more insistent creditors and indignant bankers who threatened foreclosure on overdue debts. The management frantically shifted funds from one account to another, borrowing money at ever higher interest to meet obligations it could no longer stave off. The family had to post more and more of its possessions as collateral. It had to lay off workers, some with considerable seniority, in increasing numbers, so that the workforce dwindled to little more than half its size prior to the Depression. Overshadowing every day's disheartening efforts was the fear of failure and bankruptcy, which amounted to personal disgrace for a family rooted in its community and proud of a long tradition of honesty, prudence, and solvency. For businessmen in such a plight, the liberal Hansebund observed in its annual report for 1931, politics could be reduced easily to a formulation coined by the famous 18th century German aphorist George Lichtenberg. I really can't say whether things will be better if they are changed. What I can say is that things must be changed if they are going to improve. And according to the Hansebund, that outlook was leading many German businessmen where it led the young manufacturer from Krefeld into the Nazi Party. For such men, Nazism's calculated ambiguity about basic questions of economy policy probably seemed less disconcerting than it did to big businessmen. Trapped, from their point of view, between politically determined wages on the one hand and supply prices set by the cartels and trusts of big business on the other, small and medium manufacturers were in any event less likely than the giants of industry to take alarm at the pledge in the NSDAP's program to nationalize business trusts. Because of their incessant struggles with bankers during the Depression, they were more likely to view hospitably Nazi schemes for a nationalized system of credit and a breaking of the thraldom of interest payments. Desperate for any development that would generate orders for their products, they were less likely to feel concern about the possible inflationary effects of Nazi calls for make-work projects or currency printing schemes to set the unemployed to work. Those not directly dependent on export markets must have found less threatening than did most of big business Nazi talk of repudiating foreign debts, reducing or controlling foreign trade, or even attaining economic autarky. Indeed, for many desperate small and middle-range producers, such talk probably held out the welcome prospect of relief from foreign competitors. Men who daily lived with the fear of losing their livelihoods and everything they owned were also less inclined to examine carefully all the implications of the assurances from one fork of Nazism's tongue to the effect that in a National Socialist Germany there would be no socialism in the Marxist sense, but merely unlimited government interventionist authority to direct and discipline business enterprises in the interest of the community of the Volk. Finally,
Nazism's anti-Semitism represented less of a deterrent to such entrepreneurs since the fastidiousness and urbanity that made anti-Semitism socially unacceptable among businessmen were less in evidence in their circles. For these reasons, the lesser businessmen of Germany seem more likely to have shown susceptibility to Nazism than the executives of the great firms that comprise big business. This would seem borne out by the attention the Nazis lavished during 1931 on business audiences in provincial manufacturing centers where such businessmen predominated. In May, for example, Gottfried Feder addressed a group of Augsburg businessmen invited by the local Nazi leadership, typically to a private room at the most elegant hotel in town. According to a report of the Social Democratic daily Vorwärts, he assured his listener that the NSDAP planned no socialization save in a few areas of transportation and distribution. Honestly acquired property, he emphasized, would remain in private possession. Nazism aimed at ending the class conflict artificially stirred up by socialists. Employers and employees must be brought into a closer relationship, and the socialist unions that had come between them must disappear. The Nazis would take care of that. They would also put the unemployed to work through compulsory labor service. In addition, they would break the thraldom of interest payments and severely curtail the importation of foreign goods. Where more refined methods did not work in the latter regard, direct action would. Nazi stormtroopers had, Feder informed his provincial audience, already begun to express disapproval at the purchase of foreign automobiles by hauling their owners out of the alien upholstery and physically giving them a taste of patriotic German anger.
The Nazis' radical socioeconomic line during the autumn election campaign, their strident anti-capitalist rhetoric, and their unrelenting onslaught on a chancellor who had gained the enthusiastic backing of the men of big business had a profound effect on the political behavior of the latter. Both during the campaign and after, most of the business community displayed a pronounced aversion to National Socialism. If any doubt existed about this, it was dispelled when the Nazis and their fellow travelers sought, during the maneuvering for advantage that followed the November election, to enlist big business support for the appointment of Hitler as Chancellor. Not surprisingly, the behavior of the Nazis during the fall campaign served as a brake on financial contributions to the NSDAP from big business sources. According to two men closely connected with Ruhr industry, Ludwig Grauert and August Heinrichsbauer, its politically active leaders decided to allow none of their political money to go to the Nazis. This would seem borne out by Otto Steinbrink's recollection of a visit he received in Berlin in the fall of 1932 from Walter Funk. Steinbrink recalled that Funk expressed to him on that occasion discouragement at the unresponsiveness he had encountered on a recent trip through the Western Industrial region. As an outsider in Ruhr circles, Steinbrink's employer, Friedrich Flick, remained unaffected by this ban, so that Steinbrink adhered to Flick's practice of paying insurance premiums to the Nazis, providing Funk on that occasion with what he later estimated at between 20,000 and 30,000 marks. No evidence has come to light about the disposition of I.G. Farben's political funds in the fall of 1932, but there were indications of increasingly negative attitudes toward the Nazis from that side too. In a pamphlet widely distributed in industrial circles, Karl Bosch, chairman of Farben's managing board, issued a sharp warning against the idea of economic autarky. Then an increasingly prominent theme in the propaganda of the NSDAP, which sought to capitalize on mounting agrarian demands for high protectionist tariffs and other barriers to foreign trade. Max Ilgner, the young executive in charge of Farben's Berlin office, later testified that he terminated in the fall of 1932 the monthly subsidies that he had paid to Funk since the spring. Sometime during the latter part of 1932, the sole Farben executive who had joined the NSDAP, Wilhelm Rudolf Mann, submitted his resignation from the party, a step perhaps not unrelated to efforts by the NSBO to link together Nazi factory cells in all of Farben's plants, so as to form a trade union type structure in that firm. The curtailment of financial aid from big business occurred just as the NSDAP was experiencing its first serious money problems since its rapid expansion had begun more than 2 years earlier. After the party's failure to gain a place in the government despite its landslide electoral triumph of July, the yield from its internal sources of funds fell off. The sustained growth in membership that had fed large amounts of money in the form of registration fees and dues into the Nazi organization at the grassroots slackened. Some members dropped out. Others simply ceased to pay their dues. The transmission system that had moved money from the local units upward to the regional organizations and onto the national headquarters faltered in some parts of the country, and generally delivered less than before. Weariness with the fifth major election campaign of 1932 reduced the heavy attendance at Nazi rallies that had hitherto proved such a lucrative source of funds. Profits from the party's commercial efforts also declined. Party papers found their circulation, and hence the revenues, contracting. The non-Nazi press carried rumors of mounting unpaid party debts. Despite all this, it would be misleading to speak of a crippling financial crisis of the NSDAP in the fall of 1932. The party seems to have experienced only the kind of difficulties common among rapidly expanding organizations that suffer a contraction of income, and discovered the pains of overextension as a consequence of having habitually relied on growth to meet their material needs. That is, the Nazis still had plenty of money, although their practice of spending without thought to priorities now put their resources under considerable strain. They continued to raise millions of marks from internal sources, and the availability of an abundance of volunteers and of contributions in kind from members and sympathizers of moderate means kept the NSDAP free from dependence on major financial contributions from outside sources during the autumn election campaign. This involved some activities not wholly in keeping with the party's carefully cultivated image of self-sufficiency, such as sending into the streets of Germany uniformed SA men who, tin boxes in hand, solicited passerbyers for contributions. Thanks to such efforts, and the credit rating it still commanded among many merchants, the party managed to mount its usual massive campaign. Still, the decision to adopt a posture in the fall campaign that would predictably offend big business came at an inopportune time in terms of the financial needs of the NSDAP. Yet that was clearly a price Hitler was willing to pay, along with a general diminution of sympathy for his party in business circles. In the fall of 1932, he obviously attached far less importance to the money in favor of big business than to a strategy of discrediting the Papen cabinet and resorting to intensified demagogic propaganda in an effort to hold his increasingly restive supporters in line and to attract new followers as replacements for those who defected. Disturbed by the Nazis' radicalism and intransigence, and concerned about the precarious position of the Papen cabinet, the politically active components of German industry once more assumed an active role in the autumn election campaign. In contrast to the resignation and pessimism that had gripped large parts of the business community during the campaigns of the spring and summer, renewed energy and determination became evident. Symptomatic of this was the leadership exerted by Carl Friedrich von Simons, who had withdrawn from political activity in the spring. In October, Simons joined with steelman Fritz Springorum and Albert Vogler and textile executive Abraham Frauwein to issue invitations to a special nationwide meeting in Berlin of politically active industrialists and industrial agents. The resulting gathering included such major figures of Ruhr industry as Krupp von Bohlen, Paul Silverberg, Fritz Springorum, Albert Vogler, and Hans von Löwenstein of the Bergbauverein. Simons was joined by Hermann Bucher, chief executive of the other large electro-technical firm AEG. The chemical industry was represented by the executive director of its national association. Paul Rausch did not attend, but his Berlin agent, Martin Blank, took part, sending Rausch a full report afterwards. The pro-Nazi Fritz Thyssen was conspicuous by his absence. Most of the major industrial branch and regional associates set their top officials. With the consent of its chairman, Krupp, even the Industrial Reichsverband abandoned its traditional non-partisan stance by permitting its senior staff officials to participate under the pretext that they were acting solely as private individuals. In reality, German industry convened its first national political conclave when these men gathered at the Club of Berlin on the afternoon of October 19th, 1932. Unfortunately, the Frankfurter Zeitung's political obituary proved premature by 12 years. Within less than a month of its appearance, Adolf Hitler stood at the head of the German government. The story of that unexpected and calamitous turn of events has been so often told that a brief sketch will suffice here. Schleicher, although he held both the Chancellorship and the Ministry of Defense, occupied a position more precarious than appearances indicated. Like Papen, he had to face up to the problem of an implacably hostile Reichstag majority. He displayed considerable imagination and audacity in attempting to marshal parliamentary support, or at least toleration, on the part of politicians ranging from the SPD on the left to the NSDAP. But in the end, all his stratagems failed. Even the DNVP went into opposition, leaving Schleicher with a still narrower basis of support than Papen had commanded. With the chamber scheduled to reconvene at the end of January, Schleicher, like Papen before him, called on President Hindenburg to dissolve the Reichstag and postpone new elections indefinitely so that the cabinet could rule by means of presidential emergency powers without interference from the parliament. However, Hindenburg, under the influence of the Camarilla around him, had soured on Schleicher. He refused a dissolution decree to the chancellor, who submitted his resignation on January 28th. The president then assigned the task of sounding out the parties about a new government to Papen, with whom he had parted only reluctantly in December, and who hungered both for a return to power and for revenge on Schleicher. On the basis of negotiations with Hitler and other foes of Schleicher that had begun in early January, Papen held out to Hindenburg the prospect of a broad nationalist government that would encompass the DNVP, the NSDAP, and the Stahlhelm Veterans Organization. After several days of elaborate intrigue, during which even Schleicher swung behind Hitler's candidacy in hopes of blocking a return to power by Papen, a new cabinet took office on January 30th, 1933. Hitler became chancellor, with Papen as vice-chancellor and commissar for Prussia, while Hugenberg took over both the economics and agriculture ministries. Werner von Blomberg, a general favorably inclined to the new combination, replaced Schleicher as defense minister. Besides Hitler, the cabinet included only two other Nazis, Wilhelm Frick as interior minister and Hermann Göring as minister without portfolio, charged with the duties of the Prussian minister-presidency. It at once proclaimed itself a, quote, government of national concentration. 2 days later, after negotiations between Hitler and the Centre Party collapsed, thereby ruling out a parliamentary basis for the new cabinet, the Reichstag was dissolved by presidential decree and a new national election scheduled for March 5th. Many aspects of these momentous developments have ever since remained the subject of controversy, but none more so than the role of big business. Numerous contemporary observers immediately attributed to it an important, even crucial part in the events that led to the installation of Hitler in the chancellorship. With variations, countless subsequent treatments of the subject have echoed the allegation. The generalized indictment falls, under scrutiny, into three component parts. First, it is alleged that big business played a vital part in effecting that reconciliation between Papen and Hitler that made possible their intrigues against Schleicher and their cooperation in forging the cabinet of January 30th. Second, it is contended that big business rescued the NSDAP from financial ruin after Hitler and Papen became reconciled, just in time to make possible a Nazi electoral triumph in a state election that rallied Nazism for its final, successful bid for power. Third, it is maintained that big business helped to turn Hindenburg against Schleicher and to overcome his resistance to making Hitler chancellor. In the light of the evidence that has accrued over half a century, each of these three allegations proves untenable. The charge that big business was instrumental in bringing Hitler and Papen together turns on the role of Baron Kurt von Schroeder, the Cologne banker, at whose home the two politicians met on January 4th. 1933. That meeting is rightly regarded as a major juncture since the occasion those two conspirators put aside their past differences and began intriguing to replace Schleicher's cabinet with one each hoped to control. The scene of their meeting, Schroeder's presence, and his role in the arrangements to bring the two politicians together have led many to assume that the banker, and therefore big business, had a vital hand in effecting the collaboration between Papen and Hitler that eventuated in the cabinet of January 30th. This assumption involves a number of misconceptions. Schroeder's house became the site of the meeting because its location made it convenient for Papen and Hitler, both of whom had plans for travel in the Rhineland. They sought a secret, confidential rendezvous, and Schroeder was among the few persons who knew of their intention to meet. As for Schroeder's participation in the meeting, both Schroeder and Papen later agreed that the banker played no part, and Papen maintained that Schroeder had been present for only part of his lengthy conference with Hitler. It would seem far-fetched, to say the least, to suggest that such a political outsider as Schroeder could have influenced the decision of men like Papen and Hitler in January 1933. Schroeder could not, in any event, speak for big business, as is often implied. He was merely a partner in a medium-sized provincial bank whose personal involvement with large-scale industry consisted of holding seats on the largely honorific supervisory boards of several industrial firms. He had little contact with the important figures of big business and remained unknown to most of them until he became politically involved on behalf of the NSDAP during the latter half of 1932. He did not become their agent or spokesman even then. Schroeder could play his role not because he enjoyed any great importance as a business figure, but rather because he formed a key link in a fortuitous chain of personal relationships by means of which communications could develop between two men who wanted to meet, Papen and Hitler. Schroeder's contact with Hitler went back to the banker's enlistment in late May by Nazi Wilhelm Kepler for the circle of economic advisors that erstwhile small entrepreneur was then setting up at Hitler's behest. As already mentioned, Schroeder knew Kepler as a result of the latter's unsuccessful efforts a few years earlier to raise a loan for a business venture. Not long after Schroeder agreed to join the Kepler Circle, a politician with whom he shared a mutual acquaintance unexpectedly assumed a new importance. Franz von Papen became Reich Chancellor. Soon thereafter, Schroeder met Papen through their mutual acquaintance. As one of the few persons with entree to both Papen and Hitler, two men separated by a wide social chasm, Kurt von Schroeder thus fortuitously became a man with potentially very useful connections. These connections took on great significance when Schroeder encountered Papen on December 16th, 1932, at the Berlin Herrenklub, where he had just heard the former chancellor reveal in a speech his displeasure with the Schleicher cabinet and his favorable inclination toward inclusion of the NSDAP in the government. Schroeder had a month earlier been led by Kepler to hope that Papen might look with favor on Hitler's appointment to the chancellorship, and might possibly even intercede with Hindenburg on the Nazi leader's behalf. The former chancellor's speech consequently quickened his interest and led to a conversation with Papen afterwards. Papen, whose accounts of the events leading to Hitler's appointment are notoriously untrustworthy, later claimed Schroeder first broached the subject of a meeting with Hitler on that occasion. At the time, Schroeder publicly claimed responsibility for initiating the meeting. After the war, he repeatedly testified that the initiative came from Papen. There is no way to determine which version is true, but it seems just as likely that Papen, rather than Schroeder, first raised the possibility of meeting with Hitler. Even if Schroeder took the initiative to bring Papen and Hitler together, no evidence supports the widespread assumption that he acted on behalf of big business. He may have been convinced, as he implied after the war at Nuremberg, that he acted in the interests of the business community, but its leaders remained unaware of his actions. None of the important industrialists whose views and activities for that period are documented had any recorded contact with Schroeder in December 1932 or January 1933, or showed any signs of knowing about his activities. Not even the Nazi Fritz Thyssen knew what Schroeder was up to until after the meeting of January 4th. In an affidavit that Schroeder submitted at Nuremberg in 1947, and which has received much attention in writings about the Papen-Hitler meeting, the banker stated that before complying with Papen's wish for a talk with Hitler, he had consulted with a number of gentlemen from the business community and informed himself about the attitude of the business community toward a collaboration between Papen and Hitler, which he found to be favorable. That statement has been portrayed as indisputable proof that Schroeder acted on behalf of big business. Those who take that position have, however, left unmentioned a lengthy interrogation of Schroeder at Nuremberg, during which he was pressed to identify those businessmen with whom he consulted. Asked whether he had spoken with men such as I.G. Farben's Karl Duisberg or Karl Bosch, Schroeder explained that he had not, since he had virtually no contact with Duisberg and had not at that time even met Bosch. Asked whether he had consulted anyone at the Industrial Reichsverband, Schroeder replied that he had, in 1932, nothing to do with industry and knew nothing about the workings of the Reichsverband. When the interrogator continued to press him about the identity of the businessman he claimed to have spoken with in December 1932, Schroeder admitted that his soundings had gone no further than the Kepler Circle. As mentioned earlier, the members of that Nazi-inspired and Nazi-led group in no sense constituted, as is so often alleged, an impressive or representative array of executives. Their encouragement of Schroeder hardly amounted to support on that part of German big business for his role in bringing together Papen and Hitler. Schroeder's testimony under interrogation about the importance for him of the Kepler Circle would seem borne out by his having immediately turned over arrangements for the Papen-Hitler meeting to the leader of the circle, Nazi Wilhelm Kepler. In making the arrangements, Kepler used Schroeder merely as an intermediary to Papen and as a convenient host for what proved a momentous exchange between two unscrupulous politicians eager to collaborate on the basis of one of politics' most primitive formulas, namely, my enemy's enemy is my friend. Compared with the roles played by Franz von Papen and Adolf Hitler on January 4th, 1933, Kurt von Schroeder's amounted to that of a mere spear holder on the stage of history. When a Berlin newspaper, which had somehow got wind of Papen's assignation with Hitler in time to post a reporter outside of Schroeder's house, quickly broke the central story of Papen's meeting with the Nazi leader. That news at once gave rise to a legend that had since become firmly entrenched in historical accounts of the event. That large-scale, big business financial aid flowed to the Nazis as a consequence of a deal reached during the meeting of January 4th, 1933, at Schroeder's house. No evidence whatever underlay the reports to that effect, which immediately proliferated in the leftist press. Hitler, Papen, and Schroeder all later denied that money had even been mentioned, and no evidence has later since come to light to contradict their denials. The political logic of the situation militated, in any case, against any attempt by Hitler to raise funds for the NSDAP in such fashion. In order to do so, he would have had to admit, at least tacitly, that his movement was in need, an admission that could only have weakened his bargaining position in pursuit of his paramount goal, the chancellorship. No such obvious considerations occurred to the leftist journalists of Germany, however. As soon as they heard the meeting had taken place at the house of the big banker, Schroeder, as the communist daily Die Rote Fahne described him with obvious relish and an exclamation mark in parentheses, they knew with certainty its true significance. Since Hitler had been heavily financed by many groups within Rhenish-Westphalian industry, the readers of Die Rote Fahne now learned, and since such subventions are customarily channeled through private bank houses, the background of this meeting becomes clear. The capitalists, who all along had lurked in the shadows behind National Socialism, had at last been surprised at their dirty work. Or, as in some versions, the discovery of the meeting meant that Hitler, the agent of big industry, as the SPD's organ Vorwärts labeled him, had been caught in flagrante with his big business patrons. For those who jumped to such conclusions, no doubt remained about the true nature of Nazism. It stood revealed as a demagogic tool of the same exploiters of the people who had manipulated such more conspicuous political puppets as Schleicher, Papen, and Hugenberg. In numerous imaginatively elaborated versions, this message multiplied in the left-wing publications of Germany during the final, crucial weeks of January 1933. While Hitler moved toward his goal of the chancellorship with a sure sense for the realities of power, his opponents on the left exultantly proclaimed an ultimately despairing and incapacitating message, which they insisted the meeting of January 4th had verified. Whether the Reich Chancellor was named Schleicher, Papen, or Hitler made no difference, since all were mere tools of the capitalists. The analysts of the left had convinced themselves that by bringing to the attention of the German people this incontestable corroboration of their ideologically based interpretation of National Socialism, they could set off a massive popular revulsion that would somehow sweep Nazism into oblivion. Those among them who survived the ghastly consequences of their rapidly approaching political debacle may presumably later have found at least some consolation in the many triumphs achieved in subsequent history books by their willful, biased interpretation of the Hitler-Papen agreement, according to which Kurt von Schroeder, not Franz von Papen or Adolf Hitler, loomed as the key participant. Some writers of the history of the period, unable to accept the full-blown leftist version of the meeting of January 4th, have, while leaving the matter of causation vague, alleged that large amounts of capitalist money flowed to the NSDAP immediately in the aftermath of that event. But no persuasive evidence has been adduced to support the allegation either. Nothing indicates that the Nazis received any notable infusion of funds in January 1933 from any source, much less from big business. Goebbels' published diaries, repeatedly cited in support of such allegations, reveal nothing of the sort, nor did the NSDAP's campaign for the election of January 15th in the state of Lippdeppmold. What proved a successful strategy there involved virtually total reliance on the customary Nazi technique of making campaigning pay for itself. In pursuit of Lippdeppmold's 100,000 voters, the NSDAP blanketed that tiny state with no fewer than 38 mass rallies during the 12 days preceding the balloting. To rekindle the electorate's interest, the Nazis mobilized most of the oratorical big guns of the party, including Hitler, who himself addressed no fewer than 17 rallies within 10 days. To cover their expenses, the Nazis charged those who came to hear such celebrities admission fees considerably in excess of the normal rates. The strategy worked. The NSDAP regained in Lippdeppmold enough of the votes it had lost in November to proclaim the outcome as a victory, but the campaign there proved a near thing financially. On at least one occasion, a bailiff sequestered the box office receipts for a party rally to meet the claim of impatient creditors. In his sober post-war memoir, Otto Dietrich, who served as Hitler's press agent in January 1933, recalled that the party leader's adjutant had at one point in the Lipp campaign urgently requested a personal loan of 2,000 marks from him, explaining that there was not enough money on hand to pay the rental fee demanded in advance for the hall in which Hitler was scheduled to speak the next day.
What can be said in the light of the findings presented here, by way of answering the questions posed at the outset of this volume? To what extent did the men of German big business undermine the Weimar Republic? To what extent did they finance the Nazi Party and use their influence to boost Hitler into power? As should be evident by this point, the answer in both cases is a great deal less than has generally been believed. Only through gross distortion can big business be accorded a crucial or even major role in the downfall of the republic. The business community displayed, to be sure, little enthusiasm for the new democratic state. A very few major executives could be termed Democrats by conviction. Particularly at the outset of the Republican period, they felt jeopardized by a political system that assigned ultimate authority over national policy to a mass electorate. They also deplored many Republican policies, especially the rapid expansion of the social politic welfare state legislation and direct governmental intervention in labor management relations. But once the difficulties of the Republic's first 5 years had been overcome and a measure of prosperity restored, most men of big business reconciled themselves to the new state, if not always to its policies. So long as the country prospered, they saw little chance for a change of regime. Most remained frustrated politically. Having discovered the economic potency did not translate readily into political effectiveness in a democratic polity, where ballots weighted more than money and where blocks of disciplined interest group voters counted for more than their financial contributors. Big businessmen did, to be sure, play a part in causing the crisis that eventuated the paralysis of the Republic's parliamentary system in 1930. The insistence by some sectors of big business on curtailment of the capstone of Republican social politic, the National Employment Insurance Program, helped at that time to precipitate what in retrospect emerges as one of the earliest of the now familiar fiscal cries of the 20th century capitalist welfare states. The outcome of that crisis was, however, determined not by those in the business community, but rather by the political spokesmen of organized labor. Also, the resulting parliamentary deadlock did not in itself put an end to the Weimar democracy. That stalemate assumed fateful proportions, and only because it triggered a fundamental shift of authority to the presidency through the use of emergency powers assigned to that office by the Constitution. Behind that move stood not Germany's capitalists, but rather its military leadership generals. Not corporation executives affected the establishment of presidential rule in 1930. As a consequence of that development, which initially made some of the leading figures in the business community very uneasy because of their concern about the reaction of credit markets abroad, they and their compeers found themselves with even less political influence than they had enjoyed earlier. As long as the parliamentary system functioned, the politically active elements of big business had frequently managed to combine their small parliamentary bloc with other interest groups through horse trading of the usual sort so as to influence the shape of legislation. The links between big business and those bourgeoisie parties that regularly received subsidies from it had enabled its political spokesmen to exert pressure, if not always successfully, on government policies when those parties participated in ruling coalitions under the governmental system that began to take shape in 1930. However, the wishes of the business community carried little or no weight with the decisive source of authority. President Hindenburg, or with the military men who served as his counselors during the period of presidential rule, men chose by those counselors, men not beholden to big business, to determine national policy. And it was those men, Bruning, Papen, and Schleicher, and not Germany's capitalists, who set the disastrous political and economic course that destroyed what remained of the Weimar Republic and fostered the growth of the Nazi Party. If the role of big business is the disintegration of the Republic has been exaggerated, such is even more true of its role in the rise of Hitler, while a significant part of the business community contributed to materially, if less than wholly voluntarily, to the consolidation of Hitler's regime after he had become chancellor. He and his party had previously received relatively little support from that quarter. The early growth of the NSDAP took place without any significant aid from the circles of large-scale enterprise, centered in industrially underdeveloped Bavaria, tainted with illegality as a consequence of the failed beer hall putsch of 1923, saddled with a program containing disturbingly anti-capitalist planks and amounting only to a raucous splinter group politically. The NSDAP languished in disrepute in the eyes of most men of big business throughout the latter part of the 1920s. The major executives of Germany proved, with rare exception, resistant to the blandishments of Nazis, including Hitler himself, who sought to reassure the business community about their party's intentions. Only the Nazi electoral breaking through of 1930, achieved without aid from big business, drew attention to it from the quarter. Those businessmen who attempted to assess the suddenly formidable new movement encountering a baffling riddle. The closer they scrutinized the NSDAP, the more difficult it became to determine whether it supported or opposed capitalism, and more specifically the larger scale organized enterprise to which capitalism had given rise in Germany. That riddle was not a chance occurrence. Hitler wanted things just that way. By cultivating a strategy of calculated ambiguity on economic matters, he sought to enable the appeals of his party to transcend the deep-seated social divisions in the country. That strategy led to puzzlement and wariness among the politically active components of big business who wanted above all to establish NSDAP's position on the economic issues that preoccupied them and assumed ever more urgency as the Great Depression deepened. For nearly 2 years, from the autumn of 1930 until the summer of 1932, elements within or close to big business engaged in flirtations of varying intensity and duration with National Socialism. Some saw Nazism a potential ally against the political left and organized labor, with many in the business community blamed for much of the country's misfortune, including the Depression. Some of those who harbored such hopes set out, often with the help of opportunistic intermediaries, to cultivate prominent figures in the leadership ranks of the NSDAP. On the Nazi side, Hitler and certain of his lieutenants appear to have operated initially on the same assumption that color leftist analyses, namely that capitalism amounted to an important factor in politics. But whereas the parties of the left sought to mobilize mass support against big business in order to break the alleged control of the capitalists over the state, Hitler and his accomplices set out merely to neutralize the business community politically in order to keep Germany's capitalists from obstructing the Nazis' grasp for power. Hitler and other Nazi spokesmen therefore sought repeatedly to convince those capitalists whose ears they could gain that there was no need to fear socialism from National Socialism. In a strict sense, that was true, since the Nazis did not seek government ownership of the means of production, but Hitler and other Nazi emissaries revealed only high, selective versions of their movements aimed to members of the business community. They omitted mention of aspirations of many Nazis, including Hitler himself, for far-reaching changes in the German social and economic relationships that would, among other things, have drastically impinged on the position of capitalists. Nor did they, as has often been alleged, promise to dissolve the trade unions, hold out on the prospect of lucrative armaments contracts, or project a war of exploitative conquest. The Nazi leaders may have secretly harbored such aims, but to divulge them at the time when the NSDAP was striving to attract voters from all possible quarters and gain admission to the national government would have been out of keeping with their opportunistic tactics. Instead, most portrayed Nazism to the business community as primarily a patriotic movement that would undercut the political left by wooing in the wage earners of Germany back into the quote-unquote national political camp. Ignoring the concrete economic issues that preoccupied businessmen, Hitler held out to those with whom he came into contact the prospect of a political panacea that would sweep away Germany's mundane problems by unifying it domestically and strengthening it internationally. He also soft-pedaled or left altogether unmentioned his anti-Semitism when speaking to men of big business, having recognized its unpopularity in those circles. Such reassuring versions of the NSDAP goals generally produced skeptical reactions amongst members of the business community. However, for those reassurances were offset by clamorous anti-capitalist rhetoric on the part of other Nazis and by the NSDAP's frequent alignment with the political left on concrete socio-economic issues. Right down to Hitler's installation of the chancellorship, Nazism spoke with a forked tongue and behaved duplicitously in the eyes of most capitalist magnates. As a consequence, only rarely did relations between the NSDAP and big business progress beyond the level of flirtation prior to Nazi takeover. Despite blandishments from Hitler himself and some members of his entourage, most politically active figures in the business community remained confused by the contradictory utterances about economic matters emanating from the NSDAP and uneasy about what direction the party would finally take. Aside from a few minor executives who belonged, for the most part, to the younger generations of Germans so strongly attracted to the Nazi movement, only one capitalist of note, Fritz Thyssen, became a loyal member, or adherent rather, of Nazism before 1933. Much confusion has arisen in publications dealing with the subject of this book because of the failure to distinguish between the men of big business and lesser businessmen. The prevalent categories of big business, or monopoly capital, and lower middle class, or petite bourgeoisie, have obscured the existence of a large number of substantial entrepreneurs who presided over often appreciable firms, but who occupied a place in the economy substantially different from that of the great capitalists of Germany. Consequently, support for Nazism from such lesser businessmen has frequently been mistaken as evidence of complicity on the part of big business.